Hello, everybody. It's me again, Russ Shaw, sitting behind a city bus, doing another dash cam session as the light turns green. How you doing? What's up? I want to go into some strategy today, some real strategy towards fighting this addiction. The last episode I talked about gratitude and how being mindful of the things we like, of the gifts that we have, of the people in our lives that we love, can change the heart, can bring the heart around to a different way of doing life. Now, I want to preface that a little bit. I want to get to the premise of that, I should say. Because it's not like we should just be happy all the time, and I want to address that, because sometimes we can feel like that, right? I'm listening to these lectures at Oxford University talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a scientific way of saying something that's actually very, very old. C.S. Lewis had a great quote. He said, "There's nothing that's really new. There's just old stuff being experienced by new people." So, but the cool thing about science is that, you know, when there's chemical imbalances in the mind, we can treat that with medication, and that's a good thing. Like, we live in that age where we can treat some of these things with medication, but the medication has side effects. The medication, you know, basically over time, when we start to feel right, sometimes the depression or the anxiety gets corrected by the medication. We can stop taking the medication or forget to take our medication because we feel better, right? And sometimes those can have disastrous consequences. There's all sorts of good reasons not to stay on medication. Most of the time, people who are on medication, when they get off it, they feel like they don't need it anymore. They relapse. So, you know, not to scare you about medication, but medication in and of itself doesn't necessarily work without some kind of working out in your mind what's actually true and what isn't. Okay, that's pretty important in life. There are truths, you know, there are real truth claims and there are lies. You know, and part of this whole 70s and 80s kind of philosophical teaching and atheist, you know, college professors who would come out with this relativistic kind of worldview on philosophy, like, oh, well, there's no truth, right? Like, there's just whatever you feel, right, dude? Your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. Well, it's not right. That's just not true. It's almost like common sense, but you know, there's just so many people that are just so incredibly intelligent and brilliant, but they don't know how to tie their shoes, right? They have no street smarts. I used to be a drug dealer, all right, in my former life. And there was a kind of, like, you had to have a way with people, you had to be able to trust people, you had to be able to look in the eye, shake hands with somebody, and that was a contract, right? And then there was the guy who making methamphetamine. There was the guy who knew how to do that stuff, knew how to cook that stuff. He had that kind of brain. But, you know, I wouldn't have him talk to people. You know, I wouldn't have him do a deal or meet with people. That would be wrong, because that guy doesn't have street smarts. And he would, you know, anyway, that's just something I learned from the street. And you see that today in culture. Like, there's the lawyers who draw up the paperwork, and then there's, you know, the people who do the deals. And yeah, the paperwork helps hold the deal together, but ultimately, in the end, it's a word of mouth. It's I trust you, you get me, we're doing business, that kind of thing. So, yes, there is truth, and there is lies. And you can't just have this relativistic worldview if you want to do your life properly, all right? I'm going to say that. Theology, going back to what C.S. Lewis said, and the science behind theology, the Bible, Jesus, right? I'm a Christian. I'm not a religious type Christian. I think that religion is part of the problem. I really do. I hear, you hear that in colleges too. The atheist college professor will say things like, well, I think religion's part of the problem. And the funny thing is, I agree with him. I don't like the way he rounds out and ends his theory on that. But in the end, I agree with religion being part of the problem. Honestly, that's why I'm a Christian, in investigating the truths of the gospel. These truth claims that the Bible puts out are not about religion. Like, the religious people killed Jesus. The religious elites, the people who knew their Bibles, the people that taught the Bible, the people that had whole chunks of the Bible memorized, were very good at telling people about moral law, but they in themselves and their hearts were filled with, rage and hatred, and they just didn't have a loving approach to helping people in their culture. That's what they're called to do. That's why the laws are there, but they just totally missed the big E in the eye chart and just became about religious rule and counting, steps and writing down new rules on top of the rules, and Jesus came to blow up all that, and then he said he was God, and that went bad for him, right? But proving that he was ultimate authority, he came back 3 days later. It's almost Easter. We celebrate that. It's awesome. God, the grand miracle, as C.S. Lewis put it, God became a man. He comes down into human history. Like, God would actually step out of time and space. Like, the Muslims will say, well, how can God pray to himself as Jesus? Because then there's two. That's dualism. We believe in one God. I believe in one God too. I also believe that one God created time and space and actually entered into his own story. He became a man. The grand miracle is that he actually walked among us. And that news of that changed my outlook. It changed my heart. In past episodes, I talked about snuffing out thoughts, right? Like, when I was totally jacked up, very stubbornly addicted, a thought would enter my mind, a sexual thought, right? In the beginning, I tried to manage this thing based on behavior. The behavior, look, why am I doing this thing, this behavior that's on the surface? And I realized that backing up a little, what was underneath the behavior, before the behavior was birthed out, it was a thought. It started as a thought. And sometimes these thoughts were thrown into my mind, and sometimes they were, I don't believe that every cognition comes from you. I really believe that there are enemy spirits out there that are throwing thoughts into your mind. Old porno movies, right? A sexually explicit image pops into your head. This is kind of like bait that's being dangled. I want you to think of it that way. I want you to break this, have a paradigm shift out of this thinking about triggers. Well, I had a trigger and I just couldn't help myself. I get that you may be tempted beyond what you can handle, but the Bible says that there's temptations that you can step away from, that you can step back from. And I'm saying that seeing your thoughts, right, before they become behaviors, and then snuffing those thoughts out. It's what I talked about in earlier shows, and I want to touch on that a little more. Like, the Bible in Ephesians 6 has this picture of fiery arrows. It's talking about the full armor of God, that some of these thoughts or cognitions can be fiery arrows that hit your mind, and then if we don't put out that fire, it starts to spread, right? A fiery arrow comes through the window of your house. Do you just sit there and look at it? Or do you snuff it out, right? You get a pail of water, you put that thing out. Why don't we do that, right? And I think that some of what I said was a little obvious, and it helped people, yes, but why don't we snuff out the thought? Most mostly because our attitudes and habits have become, again, going back to what the professor at Oxford said, we feel like we need to be happy all the time. We feel maybe spoiled in our culture with all our technology and all of our stuff that we should feel good all the time. So, going back to what I said in some earlier episodes of the podcast, stress is not the trigger, but the gun, all right? Like, the first step, right? The first step in the 12 steps says that I have an overwhelming addiction, which is good. It's good to break your own pride and admit that you have a problem. But if we look at stress, the things that happen in our life, fiery trials, or just the stresses of life, if we look at those as a kind of a thing that's over here, we're not really addressing the problem. Like stress is a trigger that brings me to my addiction. No, your addiction is the trigger. Stress, right? Stresses of life and the moments that we have through time. Stress is not just passing clouds, you know, that we just, oh, that's just like clouds flowing by during the day. No, stress is very real, and we react to the stresses of life every day in certain ways in our mind, in how we feel. So, again, going back to the last session of the podcast, being mindful of what you're grateful for in those moments can really help change your attitude when you feel yourself sinking, when you feel those snowballs rolling down that hill, right, to become that big snowball that you can't stop. When those thoughts come to mind, realize, right, be mindful of that's not just, right, this is not just a passing cloud through the day. This is something that you can engage. You can engage the way you feel, the way you think. The way you think will change how you feel. What's real and what's true will change the way you feel. And that's true. It's not that you do a different thing, you know. Well, you just, and I told listeners that, like, well, you just quit. You just quit on the thing, and maybe that's part of a habit that I'll talk about in a different session. But it's not so much about doing that, like it's a task. You know, you got to snuff out those thoughts like it's up here. No, you realize that the thoughts are there. Realize when they come. Realize your life in the moment. Be mindful of the moments of the day that you have to feel grateful, to not let yourself go back to that tunnel vision of there's no other way out but to go back to my addiction. That is not true. You need to snuff out that is not even true. It's a lie. All right? So I'm going to ask you to do something this week. I'm going to ask you to be mindful of the stresses throughout the day and how they make you think, how they have you react, how they make you feel, and be mindful of those thoughts. And I also want you to write down, get a pad, right? Get a notepad just from a dollar store or something, and write down lies. When you believe those lies, what does that thing tell you? What do those images that pop in your head, right? When you choose to snuff them out, is there a voice behind them that says, this is all you have to do to feel good right now? And you need to feel good right now, right? And also, you know, using the arsenal of gratitude, because it does work. Write down lies that you believe and identify them. All right? I love you guys. Later.